Hey, welcome to reading number 7 of Anatoly Fomenko's History, Fiction, or Science, chronology number 1. The 7th reading, lucky number 7, like 7 seals, 7 bowls, 7 brides for 7 brothers. Aren't you glad I don't talk like that? It could take a lot longer to get through this. No offense to anybody with a lisp. It provides me with just one more thing to make fun of so that I feel better about my pathetic existence. Last time, Fomenko went into really just tearing apart the idea of certain locations of antiquity being in the places where we have traditionally been told. And I should do something. I know I haven't done this yet, not overtly, is by saying, I don't necessarily hold the views of Fomenko, nor do I even pretend to be a representative of his views, his mind, or his voice. I am merely reading his material and providing some commentary and maybe a little bit of color, eh? So I thought it was very well done, the way that he illustrated the contradictions concerning the location of Troy, for instance, and Babylon. Really interesting overlaps there with Babylon that he was speaking of, which really reminds me. And he also, the second section was he went into geography in the Bible, which is a big issue. And I think that's one of the key issues for us to have understanding today of where we are and who we are. And, the time in antiquity that has passed that we're not very familiar with, that some sophists have diligently and meticulously hidden from us. Okay, so I was thinking about that, Babylon, right? And last time I let you know that the Bible says nowhere that Babylon was on the river Euphrates, or Perath, as they say today. Well, something kind of interesting about that too, because he was drawing parallels to Egypt. Now, I do think Fomenko maybe does too much layering of things on top of each other. Not that that's entirely uncalled for, because alternative historians have done the same thing. Guys that just believe in the 300 years, Scott, Illig, maybe Gula. One of the things that these historians, as opposed to mathematicians, have done is show the repetition in records and the repetition of empires, which should be disconcerting in the least. So I know he did some overlay with Babylon and Egypt, which ought to be Mitzrayim and Babel. But one thing I find that's kind of interesting, that's actually been sort of troubling me since I realized it, is one of the most obscure prophecies in the Old Testament, as far as I'm concerned, because I've seen nobody handle it properly. They can't properly rightly divide these time periods and what exactly is being said. It's in Daniel chapter 12. Specifically, when Daniel looks, he has this vision. It says of a man dressed in linen standing over the river. And nearly any translation that you check is going to say that. He's standing over the river. Well, at the time that Daniel was given this vision, it was either, and I'm just trying to remember. I've got these. This actually, the vision starts in like the late portions of Daniel 10. Okay. In the third year of Koresh, or Cyrus, who was the king of the Mede and Parsi, or Medes and Persians. Okay, so it's pretty late, and so you can assume that he's either stayed a basically like a state servant, which is what he was under Nebuchadnezzar, and now he is also one under Cyrus. And it looked like from earlier chapters, Darius. So then, I don't know, he would either be in Babel or maybe Susa, or they had a few other cities that he could have been in. He names some various strange rivers or waterways of some sort that we don't really see anywhere else. But in what on earth? All right, in 12, he says that he saw a man standing over 12:7 and 12:6. Behold, stood to others. This is really interesting. That's why I'm just taking the time to show you, because it has so much to do with what Fomenko had said about the locations of Babylon and Troy and biblical geography, and how what we're told about it doesn't really line up. And I had no idea that Scaliger had so much to do with the geography, or our understanding of the geography of the Bible. I didn't know that. Is that true? I can't really find further information on that. His influence on our understanding of the geography of the Bible. Okay. So, all right. He says, then I, Daniel, looked, and beheld there stood two other, one on one side of the bank of the river, one on the other side of the bank of the river. Yeah. Well, he's not using a word that is anywhere used to just denote a waterway or river. He's using a word that's ER. ER is always synonymous with Mitzrayim, which is translated as Egypt. I just found it interesting that Daniel would be serving at this time the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. And in this vision he would be having, this eschatological vision, he is seeing a man standing over not just a river, but specifically this waterway that is utterly synonymous with Mitzrayim. And it is the R. I thought I should bring that up because that's bothered me since I realized it. What are the implications? I don't know, but there it is. So today we're going to be continuing with section 12. We're still in chapter 1. It has been just utterly packed with, in my opinion, fantastic scraps of information, fruitful leads to perhaps far more understanding of the problems with dates and geography. And again, remember, there's a very complete bibliography to this and appendix, and I believe in the back of this, the appendices and bibliographies are covering, since this is the second edition, I think that it's covering all of the books, the chronology books, up to that point. So it's pretty wide. There's a lot in that bibliography. So section 12 of chapter 1 is the mysterious Renaissance epoch as a product of the Skeligerian chronology. And let me get back here. Sorry. The Skeligerian chronology is very fond of the Renaissance motif, appealing to the archetypal recurrence of the classical age. The ancient Plato is supposed to have been the founding father of Platonism. His teaching allegedly falls into oblivion for centuries to come and is revived by the famous Neoplatonist Plotinus, allegedly in 205 through 270 AD. The similarity of his name to that of his teacher is purely accidental, of course. Then Neoplatonism perishes as well, in order to be revived again in the 15th century AD by another famous Platonist, Gemisto Platon, whose name is also identical to that of his teacher as a result of sheer coincidence. The medieval Platon is supposed to have revived the ancient Platonism, having been an avid advocate of, quote, the ancient sage Plato, unquote. Furthermore, it is only in the 15th century that Plato's manuscript was unearthed. This is precisely the epoch of Gemisto Platon. Platon founds Platon's Academy in Florence in the image of the ancient Plato's Academy. A. Vasiliev writes that, quote, his, that is Platon's, sojourn in Florence had been one of the most important periods for Italy when it was importing the ancient Greek science, and Plato's philosophy in particular. Both Plato and Platon write utopian works. Gemisto Platon is reported to have been the author of the famous Tractate on the Laws, which sadly failed to reach us in its entirety. However, the full text of Plato's tractate by the same title did. Platon, who lived in the 15th century, also suggests the construction of an ideal state, with his program being extremely close to Plato's. Plotin, who had allegedly lived in 205 to 270 AD, is yet another one to have hoped the emperor would aid the foundation of the city of Platonopolis in Campania, Italy again, where he had planned to introduce communal, aristocratic institutions a la Plato. Many prominent ecclesial leaders have historical doppelgangers in Scaliger's chronology. Eusebius, in his Historia Ecclesiastica, makes many references to a certain Bishop Victor who played a key role in the so-called Easter dispute, or the introduction of the Paschalian rules. There is indeed an Easter dispute known to history and associated with the name of Victor, as reflected in the term, quote, the Paschalian cycle of Victor. However, this dispute and Victor's lifetime are ascribed to 463 AD, whereas Eusebius, who reports this, is supposed to have lived in the 3rd to 4th century AD. The Scaligerian chronology would appear to be inverted. Furthermore, in Eusebius, he tells us of a famed Dionysus, who formulated the rules for celebrating Easter. Having linked it to the spring equinox and the, quote, suffering of the Savior, unquote, according to Eusebius, Dionysus is supposed to have died in the 12th year of Galenus, which is 265 AD in the Scaligerian chronology. It is most remarkable that another well-known scientist by the name of Dionysius existed in the 6th century AD, namely Dionysius Exiguus, and that is Dionysius Exiguus, or Dionysius the Little. He is supposed to have conducted an in-depth study of the Paschalian problem and deduced the date of Christ's birth for the first time. Wow. Apart from this, he calculated the advent of Easter for many years ahead, affixing it to the spring equinox. We have two different eminent scientists by the name of Dionysius who studied the Paschalian problem and the relation of Easter to the vernal equinox, both following Victor, who already possesses a duplicate of his own. However, they are separated by a period of 3 centuries, according to Scaligerian chronology. This is evidently a mistake. There was only one Dionysius, who double existed on paper exclusively. Actually, we are to acquaint ourselves with yet another Dionysius the Little, who must have been the prototype of both. We are referring to Dionysius Petavius, who lived in the 17th century. That's right, Dionysius Petavius. We see strange duplicates in the Scaligerian history of the famous Res Romanus as well. F. Schupfert writes that, quote, the series of prominent Roman lawyers ends with Irenaeus Modestine, who died in 244 AD. After that, the entire discipline of law enters a lethargic phase, to be revived in 900 years by Irenaeus, who was the double of Irenaeus in activity as well as the name, by AF. Fomenko does a lot of brackets in here, which are his own comments. So if I do that and give you an AF, that's his little comment inserted. It's suddenly resurrected in its entirety in the primordial grace in Bologna. The medieval Irnerius, or ancient Irenaeus, the founder of the school, started lecturing in Roman law around 1088 AD, in quotes, reviving it after an alleged 9-century period of oblivion. He is also supposed to have, in quotes, collected the ancient codices of Justinian. There are 2 famous Homers in Scaligerian history, the ancient poet and the medieval Angilbert Homer, who is supposed to have belonged to Charlemagne's court in the 9th century AD. Quote, he must have received his academic name Homer for his poetical works, unquote, suggests G. Weber, in quotes, very few poetic works of Angilbert have reached us, unquote. This medieval Homer had been, quote, an important member of the circle of scientists that existed in the Aachen court of Charlemagne, unquote. It has to be noted that Charlemagne is in no way a personal name as we tend to think today. Most probably it used to mean the Great King. The question of who exactly was referred to in that manner deserves a special study, and we shall return to it below. In figure 1.44, we can see a portrait of Charlemagne painted by Albrecht Dürer in the 16th century. Nowadays, the, in quotes, ancient Roman count of time by Ideas and Calends is assumed to have gone out of use in the 6th through 7th century AD. Nevertheless, the medieval chronographers of the 14th century AD appear to have been unaware of this fact, using the long-forgotten Ides and Calends wherever they saw fit. There's a large number of such odd doubles in the Scaligerian history. We are not claiming that they prove our statements. One may indeed find a large number of isolated coincidences. What we emphasize is the global nature of these duplicates and parallels, fitting the general scheme of chronological shifts which cover sequences of hundreds of years side by side and following each other for hundreds of years to come. One of the principal indications of the medieval origins of many ancient documents is the very existence of a Renaissance epoch, when all of the ancient scientific disciplines, philosophies, arts, and culture in general are assumed to have been revived. The resplendent classical Latin degrades into a rough and clumsy lingo that only manages to regain its former splendor in the Renaissance epoch. This revival of Latin and classical Greek begins in the 8th through 9th century AD at the latest. The famed medieval troubadours begin to use the plots that the historians call a masquerade of classical recollections in the alleged 10 and 11th century. The history of Ulysses, or the Odyssey, appears in the 11th century as a medieval remake of the well-known classical story, complete with knights, bells, dames, jousting tournaments, etc. In fact, all the elements that shall latter be considered integral to classical plot. The troubadours were proudly claiming the story, the Trojan War, to have been an original one. It had neither been told nor written by anyone before. The troubadours' primary concern was the Trojan War. It had almost been a native story for them. The Franks considered themselves descendants of the Trojans, while the alleged 7th century author Fredegarius Scholasticus refers to King Priam as a representative of the previous generation. Furthermore, the voyage of the Argonauts became confused with the Trojan War, when the Crusader conquerors, apparently the medieval prototypes of the ancient Argonauts, AF, had set forth in the direction of faraway Asian lands. In medieval texts, the ancient Alexander the Great, in quotes, compliments the French. I'm sorry, I had to soak that in. I wasn't sure if I really understood what he just said. Because he just said in medieval texts, the ancient Alexander the Great, and then he puts in quotes, compliments the French. So I just have to real quickly give you the bibliographical note here. It's item 335. In the bibliography, it says 335 is the History of French Literature, Collected Essays, St. Petersburg, 1887. English edition, the Demogiot. History of French Literature, London. Anyways, interesting. So I'm not sure exactly what Fomenko means when he says that that in medieval texts the ancient Alexander the Great, in quotes, compliments the French. Does that mean that their empires are similar? Charlemagne similar to Alexander the Great? Does he mean that Alexander the Great in that literature compliments the French? Like, how good their food is? So I'm trying to figure out exactly what he means by that, but it's a really interesting and both interesting and cryptic thing to say. Certain Slavonic texts of the Middle Ages use the name Parizh, P-A-R-I-Z-H, the Russian name for the city of Paris, in order to refer to Paris, the abductor of Helen, when they speak of the ancient Trojan War. Could it have referred to somebody from Paris? The following is said, for instance, quote, Paris, with the ZH, called himself Alexander and deceived Helen. The same medieval texts often demonstrate the flexion of P and F spelling Parizh, P-A-R-I-Z-H, and Farizh, F-A-R-I-Z-H. On figure 1.45, we see an ancient miniature from the Great French Chronicle dated to the alleged 15th century that depicts the Trojan origins of the Franks. Modern commentary is as follows. Quote, the miniature illustrates the idea that the French can trace their ancestry back to Franchion, the son of Hector and grandson of the Trojan king Priam. This is why we see the foundation of Paris directly under the picture of the fall of Troy. So Troy barely has the time to fall when Paris is founded! Exclamation point. The ancient Troy is also represented as a medieval city here. Scaligerian chronology reckons that the so-called apocalyptic nations of Gog and Magog, mentioned in the Bible, disappeared from the historical arena in the early Middle Ages. However, reading modern commentary to the medieval Alexandria, we find out that, quote, the names Gotti and Magotti must be a repercussion of the apocalyptic nations of Gog and Magog, identified as the memories of the Goths and the Mongols. And then in parentheses, the book of Revelation 20, who were well known in the Middle Ages. Okay. The pressure of Scaligerian chronology and all of these oddities brings historians to the conclusion that, quote, the Middle Ages were the time when all idea of chronological consequentiality had been lost. Monks with crosses and thuribles at the funeral of Alexander the Great, Catalina attending Mass, Orpheus becomes a contemporary of Aeneas. Good grief, Aeneas. I have no idea. Sardanapal, a Greek king, and Julian the Apostate, a papal chaplain. everything acquires a hue of fantasy in this world. This perplexes the modern historian greatly, AF. The most blatant anachronisms and the strangest fancies coexist peacefully. All these facts and thousands of others are rejected by historians since they contradict the consensual chronology of Scaliger and Petavius. Christian saint and, quote, ancient pagan characters, unquote, can be seen side by side on medieval Gothic cathedrals. Figures 1.46, which shows the sculptures of Aristotle and Pythagoras, together with the Christian saints from the western facade of the Chartres Cathedral. The historians try to explain this chronological heresy in a rather vague manner. Quote, Aristotle and Pythagoras, ... the two pagan philosophers, on a Christian cathedral symbolize the importance of scientific knowledge. Yes. The oldest biography of the ancient Aristotle is dated to 1300 AD. The manuscript's condition rapidly deteriorates. Certain places which could be read perfectly well in the 14th century are of great effort to make out nowadays. All of this despite the fact that, according to Scaligerian chronology, certain manuscripts whose age exceeds 1,000 years are still perfectly legible, and their parchment remains in an excellent condition. Historians are most probably right in their estimation of manuscript destruction rate. Many old texts may be well preserved precisely because they really are not quite as old as we think them to be. Presumably, quote, the best Greek codices of Aristotle's works belong to the 10th through 12th century. The ancient argument between the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle is revived in the 15th century, when Platon and Scholarius, a devotee of Aristotle, engage in a similar dispute. This is yet another odd medieval duplicate of ancient events. The history of Europe's first acquaintance with the works of Aristotle wasn't studied until the 14th century. It is written that, quote, Aristotle's philosophy had remained in a state of stagnation and taciturnity only 1,230 years since the birth of Christ. The Latin population learnt of the philosophy of Aristotle. We would also like to quote the opinion of contemporary historians on the issue, namely that, quote, the medieval authors had a penchant for referring to texts that they often were altogether unacquainted with. In the Middle Ages, the somewhat barbaric shape of the dispute between the realists and the nominalists really represents the renaissance of the two immortal schools of idealism and empiricism. Nominalism and realism signified a rebirth of the teachings of Plato and Aristotle in the 12th century. It is also assumed that the originals of Plato's and Aristotle's works were unknown in Europe in that epoch. They weren't yet written, perhaps. Yet another chronological dispute. Antiquity equals the Middle Ages. 3 of the 4 principal philosophical systems of the classical age were represented in the medieval science. In the 12th through 13th century, Paris, quote, the collision of realism and nominalism gave birth to skepticism, at least, another system that was the latest to have appeared in Greece had also seemed imminent, namely that of mysticism. Indeed, mysticism soon becomes again revived by Bonaventura. Thus, the evolution of medieval philosophy faithfully mirrors even the minute details of the development of its predecessor. Let us present this information as a table. Oh, sorry. The table is actually right here. And if I can get good and close, which I can. Now, in this table, he has the Middle Ages column on the left, and then the Classical Age column on the right. And as I read these, I'm going to read the Middle Ages and then the Classical Age. I'm assuming this table is meant to show the not just similarity but duplicate nature of the two. Okay, so with Middle Ages, realism. The Classical Age, idealism. Middle Ages, nominalism. Classical Age, empiricism, and so forth. Okay, so point 3, Platon, the initiator of the revival of Platonism, or Plato, the founder of Platonism. How about Scalarius, the initiator of the revival of Aristotelism, or Aristotle, the founder of Aristotelism? 5, confrontation between the two schools. 5, confrontation between the two schools. 6, confrontation between Platon and Scalarius. 6, confrontation between the Platonists and the Aristotelists. 7, the nascence of skepticism, or the nascence of skepticism. 8, mysticism evolves after the three schools, or mysticism evolves after the three schools. And 9, the total of 4 principal medieval schools of thought, and 9, a total of 4 principal classical schools of thought. That's more than similar. How interesting. Okay. A long time before the discovery of the ancient manuscript of the Golden Ass, the entire ass topic, has been well developed by the medieval troubadours. The classical ass story that surfaced, I feel guilty just reading this, that surfaced as late as the Renaissance is a logical conclusion of the entire medieval cycle. One has to note that long before the discoveries of the classical originals, all of the main plots they contain had been developed by the troubadours, the ancient originals being in fact subsequent chronologically as well as structurally. Long before the discovery of the ancient fables of Aesop, similar tales were told in the Middle Ages in the alleged 11th through 13th century. An important fact to note is that the ancient people didn't have fixed names in the modern sense. What they used instead were aliases, which had explicit meanings in the original language. The aliases characterized a person in some manner. The more remarkable qualities a person had, the more aliases he or she would be likely to possess. B.L. Smirnov says that, quote, one seldom finds a name that would mean nothing, unquote. That's fascinating too, because that's one of the greatest things about the names throughout the Bible. They all mean something. Their parents named them, usually the mothers more than the fathers, named them according to something that happened during their conception or around the time of their birth. All those names have meaning, have real world meaning. So anyways, also see J. Fraser's works, and he lists them in the bibliography. For instance, the Chronicles could refer to an emperor by the alias used in their own region, and so different chronicles referred to the same rulers by different names. The Egyptian pharaohs used to have different names before and after their coronation, as multiple coronations would take place in different regions. The list of names kept growing. These aliases usually translate as, quote, the mighty, or, quote, the fair, etc. The father of a Roman consul who lived in the alleged year 169 BC had 13 names. His son had 38. Good grief. I can't even remember 38 phone numbers. The Torah scholars quote 94 names for the biblical God. Really? Okay. The same phenomenon was typical in Russian history. Tsar Ivan III was also known as Timothy. Tsar Basil III was known as Gabriel. Prince Dmitri, who had been killed in Uglich, was called Uar. One name was secular, the other ecclesial. The name Uar most probably simply meant Tsar. Nowadays, we tend to assume that medieval names differed significantly from the ancient ones. However, the analysis of a number of texts shows us that ancient names were in use throughout the Middle Ages. Nilus of Sinai, who is supposed to have died in 450 AD, writes to his contemporaries addressing them with typically ancient names. Apollodorus, Amphiction, Atticus, Anaxagoras, Demosthenes, Asclepiodes, Aristocles, Aristarchus, Acliviades, Apollos, etc. Thank goodness that's over. Many of the names considered quote, exclusively ancient, unquote, nowadays were still in use in Byzantium in the 12th through 14th century. Georgius Franz used the following names in his History: Antioch, Argo, Amorius, Hermetion, Demetrios, Dionysius, Dioscorus, Epidaurus, Calliope, Cleope, with an E at the end, Critopulus, Laconicus, Macrobius, Minos, etc. Typical ancient names worn by people of the 8th through 15th century. That's a long time. Handwritten books remained in existence for a long time after the invention of the printing press. They were made in large quantities in the 15th through 18th century, all across Europe. In the Balkans, quote, handwritten books managed to compete with the printed ones, unquote, as recently as the 14th century. Apart from a few exceptions, the entire Irish literature of the 7th through 17th century, quote, only exists in the handwritten form, unquote. Up until 1500 AD, 77% of all printed books are supposed to have been in Latin, possibly due to the fact that Romantic fonts, Romanic, not romantic, Romanic. I would think it would be Roman, but okay, Romanic fonts were easy to make. Other fonts made their way into the printing practice extremely slowly. Diacritic signs were difficult to make, as well as the ones used for stresses, vocalizations, etc. This is why, quote, the scribes remained without competition in what concerned copying the Greek, Arabic, and Hebraic manuscripts for centuries after the invention of the printing press. This may be the reason why many Greek, Arabic, and Hebraic manuscripts considered very ancient really pertain to the epoch of printing. Among them are many classical texts, Tischendorf's biblical codices, etc. See Chronicles 6, chapter 2. Maybe I will. It appears that the region richest in handwritten books dating from the epoch of printing was Greece. The country that is considered to have a very long ancient history, one that gave the world a large number of, in quotes, ancient manuscripts. Historians tell us that, quote, due to the lack of publishing houses in Greece, books were copied manually, unquote. One wonders how many handwritten books of the 15th through 19th century were to be declared ancient later on. The following information clearly demonstrates the lack of a solid scientific foundation under the very concept of paleographical dating. That is, dating by the, quote, handwritten style, unquote. It turns out that the creation of the deluxe Greek codices with the text of ancient authors was ordered by humanists and philanthropist collectors. Let us repeat the question. How many of these medieval codices were later declared extremely ancient? One might suggest a method that allows the differentiation between real manuscripts and handwritten copies of printed books, namely, comparing the misprints in the printed versions with the handwritten errors, since during the manual copying of printed literature, most misprints would get copied as well. The foundations of the Scaligerrian chronology had been laid by the analysis of written sources, a secondary analysis of these datings free from a priori hypothesis about the antiquity of the documents may lead to the discovery of serious contradictions, as we have demonstrated. Now, Section 13. The foundations of archaeological methods have been based on the Scaligerrian chronology from the very beginning. I'm going to like this. It starts out with a quote. How come there was no battle? The results of excavations conducted by the Swiss anthropologist George Glovacki in Italy proved sensational. The scientist discovered that there was no military action conducted in the area where the troops of Hannibal had allegedly defeated the Roman legions in battle, or in the Battle of Cannae. A study of the barrows showed that the remains belong to the victims of the 8th century plague epidemic and not to Roman soldiers, as everyone was accustomed to thinking. And that is from Sovetskaya Russia, 28th November 1984. Now, Section 13.1, the ambiguity of archaeological datings and their dependence on the existing chronology. The reader may inquire about the state of affairs concerning other methods of dating historical sources and artifacts used nowadays. Yes, modern archaeologists speak of the, in quotes, ignorant diggers of the previous centuries in painted tones, since many artifacts have become defaced in the search for valuables. The archaeologist, his name was Count A.S. Auvarov, excavated 7,729 mounds in the Vladimir Suzdal area. A.S. Spirtsin has the following to say about it. Quote, when the items found in the excavations of 1851 through 1854 came to the disposal of the Rumiantsev Museum, they were a chaotic pile of materials with no markings whatsoever, and no one could tell which mound this or the other object had belonged to. The grandiose excavations of 1851 through 1854 shall be mourned by the scientists for years to come, unquote. Nowadays, the excavation methods are a lot more advanced. However, applying them to ancient excavations is an impossibility, since these have already been conducted by the, in quotes, diggers of the past. The basics of archaeological dating methods are as follows. Quote, the best way of deducing the age of a given European culture is finding out which Egyptian dynasty this European tribe traded with, unquote. The findings of Mycenae-made Greek vessels in the Egyptian mounds of the 18th through 19th dynasties allow the archaeologists to consider the dynasty and the culture as contemporaries. Similar vessels are found later on in Mycenae, together with a particular kind of pin that is later also found in Germany near some urns. A similar urn is found near Fenger, together with a different kind of pin, which resembles the one found in Sweden, in the so-called Barrow of King Bjorn, which can thus be dated as a contemporary of the 18th through 19th Egyptian dynasties. However, it turns out that King Bjorn's barrow, quote, could not have belonged to Bjorn, king of the Vikings, a well-known medieval character, since it predates his time by about 2 millennia. That's 2,000 years. Firstly, one fails to understand what criteria of similarity have been used here. Secondly, and a lot more importantly, all of these methods are heavily dependent on the a priori datings of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh dynasties. This method, which is also known as the dominoes method, and all similar ones are based on pure, unadulterated subjectivism, and principally on Scaligerian chronology. Newly found artifacts such as vessels are compared to similar findings dated in accordance with the consensual chronology. The alteration of the chronological scale automatically alters the chronology of the new archaeological findings. An erroneous chronology completely invalidates all such methods. Excuse me. It is little wonder that the archaeologists inventing their trust in such methods are constantly confronted with bizarre facts. It appears that, quote, in certain remote parts of Europe, one encounters the coexistence of things whose prototypes in the East are separated from each other by centuries. Furthermore, L.S. Klein firmly denies all connections between King Bjorn's barrow and the medieval Bjorn, king of the Vikings. This method tells us only that Bjorn's barrow is contemporary to the 18th through 19th Egyptian dynasties. It tells us nothing about the possible datings of these actual reigns, which may well be medieval, along with Bjorn the Viking. In quotes, the first schemes of Egyptian chronology were based on the work of Menathon, who had compiled the list of the pharaohs, allegedly in the 3rd century BC AF, and grouped them into 30 dynasties, having added up all the years of reigns, and assuming that their reigns have all been consecutive AF. The figure he got provided formidable, oh boy, Flinders Petrie, L. Borhart, and other Egyptologists had estimated the duration of the history of ancient Egypt to equal 5,000 to 6,000 years. This is how the long chronology of Egypt was born, the one that had been prevalent for a long time. E. Meyer and his followers had developed the so-called short chronology as an alternative. The problem is that the pharaohs and their entire dynasties often reigned simultaneously as co-rulers in different parts of the country. Menathon was making the assumption that the state had been a monolithic one under a single ruler, and so he had lined all of the pharaohs into a sequence and thus considerably extended the entire history of the state. Well, at this point, I would have to say that if Egypt is truly the modern equivalent name of the Mitzrim of the Bible, I can tell you that nowhere does it state that ever more than one Paro, P-R-O-E, or Pharaoh, ever reigned at a time. Ever. And we're not given many names of these Paros. Anyways. We should add that the short chronology of Egypt is still way too long, and should really have been called a slightly shorter chronology. As we have already mentioned in reference to the data provided by the Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch, the so-called short chronology is also based on ethereal foundations. We learn that its creator, E. Meyer, has based his deductions on the annual records and entries referring to memorable events made by the pharaohs themselves. However, this chain of knowledge has reached us as separate links with many gaps and distortions. This is why attaching the archaeological material to the, in quotes, Egyptian scale does not solve the problem of absolute, or indeed even relative, dating. The next section, 13.2, is going to wait one moment while I muse just a bit, thinking, all right, so let's just go with what history and chronology, let's say, of Europe that we've got to work with right now. And we don't even need Europe. I mean, we can transfer this to other lands in which maybe there are many different tribes and cultures in that land, but they all seem to also have an extremely similar culture and similar terms. Like, consider, in around Europe, we see titles like Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar, and other terms that seem to be very, very similar. What about Charlemagne? Is that a derivative term from Sarlemagne? I don't know. I'm just musing here. But what I'm doing is I'm seeing the ubiquitous nature of a title in any given area. So maybe, just maybe, that let's say there is this area, whatever the area was that we're talking about. And again, we can't necessarily trust where they say they've excavated a number of important items. And I have to tell you, it would just be so easy to fake a stela or stel, however you want to pronounce it, a stone with writings or hieroglyphics. So how do you not know that at any given time in a number of the surrounding countries / tribes / cultures, they didn't also have pharaohs or pharaohs as a title, just like Tsar or Caesar? Pharaoh? Don't know. It's just a thought, though. And, yeah, I think I can get through section 13, too. It is the excavations of Pompeii, the dating of this town's destruction. Let me get forward to the first image he's going to be referring to. There we go. The excavations of the ancient town of Pompeii are a perfect illustration to the problems that arise in the dating of archaeological materials. First and foremost, it isn't clear which year's eruption destroyed it. Apparently, the 15th century author Jacopo Sannazaro wrote, quote, "We are approaching the town, Pompeii, and could already see its towers, houses, theaters, and temples untouched by the centuries." And Fomenko puts in brackets a question mark and an exclamation point, because that's perplexing. I agree. It is assumed, however, that the town of Pompeii has got destroyed and completely buried after the eruption of 79 AD. This is why the archaeologists have to interpret Sannazaro in the following manner, in quotes, "In the 15th century, some of the buildings of Pompeii were already emerging from the debris." Oh, man. That's shoveling it on pretty thick. It is thus assumed that Pompeii had been covered by a thick layer of earth, since the ruins of the town were only found in 1748, and the discovery was purely accidental. Herculaneum was discovered in 1711. Nowadays, the history of the discovery of Pompeii is related after the documented recollections of that epoch as follows. Quote, "During the construction of a canal on the river Sarno, the ruins of an ancient town were found," and this was about 1594 through 1600. "Nobody had the merest notion it might be Pompeii. Methodical scientific excavations were started as late as 1860 by Giuseppe Fiorelli. However, his method of work was far from the usual scientific standards. The excavations were indeed conducted in a barbaric manner. Nowadays, It is hard to estimate the damage done by the sheer vandalism of that time. If somebody thought a picture or a figurine wasn't artful enough or visually pleasing, it would become destroyed and thrown away as trash. Sculpture fragments had been sold as souvenirs, often as statuettes of saints. Some of these, in quotes, Christian forgeries may have been medieval originals that did not fit the Scaligeриan chronology and hence wound up sold as souvenirs instead of becoming part of a museum's collection. If one's cogitation is to be confined within the paradigm of the Scaligeриan chronology, the artistic level of the artifacts found in Pompeii is very high indeed. Be it frescoes, inlays, or statues, the state of science is also deemed advanced enough to correspond to that of the Renaissance epoch. One of the findings was a sundial with uniform hourly divisions, which were considered a high level of precision even towards the end of the Middle Ages. This finding was analyzed by N.A. Morozov in Ancient Picture of a part of such a device that had been found on a villa near the town of Pompeii. It can be seen in figure 1.47. And this is the one that pretty hard to make out. It looks like some kind of a sphere with a point at the top sitting on perhaps a rectangular base. The quote underneath this image says, ancient, in quote, mural from the Boscoreale villa near Pompeii. In quotes, we can distinctively see a terrestrial globe shown in an approximate perspective. The object was also related to the sundial. Yeah, actually, okay. So, I don't know that much, but what I'm looking at here, I don't know. I don't know that I would call it a globe. I don't know what exactly I would call it. Is it an instrument of measure of some sort? I don't know. Maybe. It's interesting looking, though, to be sure. Okay. V. Kleskovsky wrote that, quote, a set of surgical instruments has been discovered that is all the more noteworthy since some of the items have been previously supposed to belong to the modern times, discovered and introduced by the scientific avant-garde of the operative medicine. Some of the graffiti art found on the walls of Pompeii is clearly medieval in its origin. For instance, the picture of a hooded henchman. We see a medieval henchman that drags his victim, a man in a cape, onto a scaffold with a rope. V. Kleskovsky tells us that it is a copy from a drawing made on plaster with some sharp object. Another drawing that is definitely worthy of our attention is that of a medieval warrior wearing a helmet with a visor. These two drawings are but a small part of the Pompeian graffiti that is explicitly medieval in its context. One should mark the illustration that one sees on page 44 of 873. That is a bibliographical reference, figure 1.50, and I can't go to that. Nowadays, we are told that it portrays ancient gladiators, so this must be it on the next page. So these two are apparently the etchings he's talking about, which, I mean, yeah, to me, found on the walls of Pompeii. To me, it looks childish. It's like scribbling, as if a child scribbled this, to me. If that be the case, then I would think it's then possibly very honest. So these are the graphics that he's referring to. It portrays ancient gladiators. However, what we see is clearly a medieval knight with a visor on his helmet. This is well-known military equipment of the Middle Ages. Sure. V. Klaskovsky sums up his general impression of the excavations of Pompeii as follows. I've been amazed many a time to find that ancient Pompeian artifacts often prove to be the spitting images of the objects of a much later epoch. That is interesting. We also find out that, according to Klaskovsky, many of the famous Pompeian inlays bear an amazing resemblance to the medieval frescoes of Raphael and Giulio Romano in composition, coloring, and style. To put it simply, they look like medieval frescoes. An example of such an inlay can be seen in Figure 1.51, which would be, yes, over here, 1.51. Actually, it's a very nice drawing or drafting. This is assumed to be the ancient battle of Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius on the right. The inlay was discovered in 1831 and is now in the domain of the National Museum in Naples. V. Klaskovsky's comment runs as follows, quote, on the floor of the triclinium, one sees the famous mosaic from colored stone, which now crowns the collection of the museum in Naples. The coloring and the technique are unparalleled. The composition may well be compared to the best works of Raphael and Giulio Romano. I guess, yeah, Giulio Romano. I have to go through, I got to bounce through so many languages here, pronouncing them. It's most remarkable indeed that there should be a semblance between the work of the anonymous ancient artist and Raphael's battle between Constantine and Maxentius in style and composition of the main group. Certain decorations of the Roman Thermae of Titus bear amazing resemblance to some of Raphael's frescoes as well. Huh. And I'm just looking and appreciating what I'm seeing here. So okay. The Scaligerian history as follows by Klaskovsky tries to convince us that all these works of ancient art were created in the 1st century AD, the latest, and have remained buried until very recently, when the excavations of Pompeii finally began. Raphael, Giulio Romano, and other artists of the Renaissance are supposed to have created paintings strongly resembling these ancient originals, without even having seen them. All of this is highly suspicious. The hypothesis that we put forward is as follows. Pompeii is a medieval town of the Renaissance epoch. It has been destroyed by one of the relatively recent eruptions of Vesuvius. The ancient Pompeian artists were contemporaries of Raphael and Giulio Romano, hence the stylistic semblances. Pompeii might have been destroyed and buried by ashes during the well-known eruption of the Vesuvius that occurred in 1500, or even by the eruption of 1631. See more in Chronicles 2, Chapter 2. Most of the Pompeian graffiti cannot be used for dating purposes, such as quotidian announcements, slang, etc. However, some of the inscriptions explicitly contradict the Scaligerian chronology. One of them can be found in the references 389. in the bibliography, and was translated by N.A. Morozov as follows, quote, "The hunt and the decorations of Valentus Nero Augustus the Holy, son of the holy D. Lucretius Valentus the Eminent, the 28th of March," unquote. We run into a contradiction between the Skeligerian history and actual inscriptions discovered as a result of excavations. An emperor with the double name of Valentus Nero is mentioned here, whereas in Skeligerian chronology these names belong to two different emperors separated by about 300 years. A longer version of the same ancient announcement referring to the pageants of 6th through 12th April can be seen in the references 873, number 73. He says, see figure 1.52. And that is actually this right here on this page. The translation offered by V. Fyodorova in 873, page 74, separates Nero from Valentus, as we had expected. We had no opportunity of checking the authority of both translations. Artifacts of the Christian epoch have been found in the ancient town of Herculaneum. Okay. In figure 1.53, for instance, we can see a Christian chapel discovered during the excavations of Herculaneum with a large cross on the wall. And this is, the photo is here. And yes, it appears to be a wash. It looks to me like a wash basin. I don't know, inside of a structure perhaps. There is a bowl in front near the floor, and there is a bowl, a shallow bowl in the wash basin, and it appears to have a cabinet within it. It's very hard to make out. Strange looking piece of furniture. All right, I'm at 117, and there are many subsections to section 13 to go, so I'm going to have to wrap here. So I'm sure that really everybody who's listening to this has seen The Truman Show. And there's that scene in The Truman Show where they're trying to reinforce a defeatist mentality in Truman so that he doesn't desire to venture out beyond this contrived world that he's imprisoned in. And when he's a kid, a child, not a kid is a offspring of a goat. When he's a child, he tells his teacher that he wants to be an explorer like the great Magellan. To which his teacher replies, "Well, it's too late. Everything's been discovered. No need. Try something else." I don't know if these creators who make things like The Truman Show, Dark City, The Matrix, I don't know if subconsciously they know that there's something wrong. I don't know if they're being subconsciously prodded to include certain concepts into what they're doing, or not. I'm just not sure. Or if some of that is deliberate, being deliberately done in a mocking sort of way. I don't know. I think a lot of people who comment on the occult or secret societies, the elites in the know, I don't know how much they actually really know about how that works. I know that it's difficult for people to fleece others for their monetary support without seeming to be an authority of some kind or another. So I just don't know. But in that same vein, as Truman's teacher tried to discourage him from going out and exploring, wanting to know anything about the world around him, I think that's where we are. I think that many people really do believe that we are living in a world wherein most of everything of fascination has been discovered. That the academics and scientists, so-called, have, for the most part, really hit the nail on the head with their observations, discoveries, maps, histories, assumptions of the way that the world works. But I think, in contrast to that we stand at the border, or the Gabul in Hebrew, of a vast area of knowledge. Knowledge that has been concealed, hidden, lost. I don't believe this in any way should be regarded by anyone, especially our young people. And I'd love to reinforce this over and again in the minds of our young people, that they have the opportunity, more than they ever had dreamed. They have the opportunity of discovery like they never thought possible. But as long as their minds are kept imprisoned by foolish, meaningless, unproductive entertainment, games, social media, and the Rockefellerian corruption of what's supposed to be education, our young people are trapped in a prison of their minds. They are trapped in a dungeon of their own lusts. Such a great evil has been perpetrated upon all of mankind in the sense of quietly dashing the hopes of discovery of man by subliminally implanting the idea that there is nothing to be gained but paltry, useless, temporary riches of only the physical, temporal kind. When what our young people don't seem to understand is that if they go for that, if they stay imprisoned in this, if you will, matrix, they are trading off all of the wealth of the discovery of the truth, which I believe right now lays predominantly hidden, waiting to be discovered by those who are brave enough, and more appropriately, those who God calls to be the minds and the strength that will lead, hopefully, the generations of my daughter, my son, and their children through this wilderness of understanding into a far better future. So I don't get up every day thinking, oh, what a drag. What a drag. And waiting for this great change or for this dark hammer to drop either. I know that we've all been misled. We've all been misled for generations upon generations. We're lost. We're confused. Well, to an extent. Personally, I don't feel lost at all. I feel anger at being misled. I feel indignation at the misguiding of my parents and their parents and their parents. But I don't feel a doom or a gloom because there is hope. There is such a great deal of hope that doesn't seem to be right out there that is touchable, but I promise you it is. And one of the reasons that I have that great hope is because I rest all my faith, all my security, all of my great lack of understanding, all of the dark segments of my knowledge, which are great. But I rest all of them on the goodness, the kindness, and the mercy of that very God of the Holy Bible. You can think it to be foolishness if you want, and I'm fine with that. It won't make me miss any sleep. So, next time, I hope to see you all again when we pick up at section 13.3, the allegedly accelerated destruction of the ancient monuments. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to that. Take care.